The white Ford Bronco chase was not just a fugitive story, it was the moment American television turned a murder case into a national ritual. For hours on June 17, 1994, the central image was almost unbearably strange. A former football hero, actor, broadcaster, and advertising figure was not running at high speed from police. He was sitting inside a white Ford Bronco, driven by Al Cowlings, his longtime friend and former football teammate, while law enforcement followed across Southern California freeways. The pace was slow. The danger was not. The country watched a man charged with murder fail to surrender, disappear from the expected legal process, and reappear as the passenger in a moving vehicle surrounded by police, helicopters, cameras, and public fascination. That contradiction is where the O.J. Simpson case entered television history. Not in the courtroom first, not in a verdict first, but on the freeway before the trial had begun, when a double murder charge collided with celebrity in real time. The deaths at the center of the case had occurred 5 days earlier. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were killed outside Brown Simpson's Brentwood home on June 12, 1994. Their deaths began the criminal case of Trady Hyman Honcourt. The chase did not create the tragedy. It transformed the public scale of it. What had started as a homicide investigation in Los Angeles became a shared national viewing event, one that pulled together grief, suspicion, spectacle, and the already immense public image of O.J. Simpson. By June 17th, Simpson had been charged with the murders. He was expected to surrender. Instead, he did not appear at the scheduled time. At 1:50 in the afternoon, LAPD Commander David Gascon publicly announced that Simpson had not surrendered and was a fugitive. That announcement mattered because it changed the posture of the day. Simpson was no longer only a famous suspect negotiating surrender through lawyers. He was now, in the words of law enforcement, a fugitive from a murder charge. The machinery of public attention moved quickly. Los Angeles County District Attorney Gil Garcetti warned that anyone helping Simpson flee could be prosecuted as a felon. Simpson's lawyer, Robert Shapiro, was involved in surrender negotiations. Later that afternoon, at a 5 o'clock press conference, Robert Kardashian, Simpson's longtime friend, read a letter from Simpson. The letter itself became part of the live public crisis because the legal drama was already unfolding through cameras, microphones, and broadcast interruptions before the Bronco was fixed in the national imagination. This is one reason the chase cannot be treated as a simple police pursuit. It was a law enforcement event, but it was also a media threshold. Simpson's fame had been built over decades through institutions that made Americans feel they knew him. He had been a football star, a television personality, an actor, a broadcaster, and a familiar presence in advertising. His public identity carried ease, charisma, and recognition. On June 17th, that image was forced into direct contact with an accusation of double murder. The result was not only shock, it was disorientation. Viewers were asked to reconcile two public images at once, the celebrity they recognized and the murder defendant being pursued by police. The Bronco became the place where those images overlapped. It was ordinary in shape and extraordinary in meaning, a vehicle moving through familiar roads while carrying an almost impossible contradiction. The roads themselves mattered. The pursuit would move through Southern California freeway infrastructure that millions of people understood not as abstraction, but as everyday geography: the Santa Ana Freeway, the Artesia Freeway, and the San Diego Freeway. According to the Los Angeles Times timeline, the California Highway Patrol pursuit began at 5:56 in the evening. The Associated Press later described the pursuit as covering about 60 miles of freeways and city streets. It was not the classic chase image of sudden speed, reckless turns, and violent capture. It was slow, tense, and suspended. That slowness changed the experience of watching. The audience had time to gather. People stood along roadways and overpasses. Television cameras had time to follow. Newsrooms had time to stay with the image. Families at home had time to ask what they were seeing and why they could not look away. Britannica states that the televised attempted escape was seen by an estimated 95 million viewers. The exact experience varied by household, by city, by race, by personal history with police and celebrity, but the scale of the event was unmistakable. For television, the chase revealed a new kind of power. Breaking news was not merely delivering information. It was creating a shared public moment as it happened. The Bronco pursuit was unresolved live drama, and that unresolved quality gave the broadcast its force. Police were following. Simpson was inside. Cowlings was driving. The outcome was uncertain. Viewers knew that two people had been killed, that Simpson had been charged, and that he had not surrendered. They also knew that the man inside the vehicle was one of the most recognizable figures in American sports and entertainment. The case would later become known as the trial of the century, and the phrase was not only about the courtroom. The trial that began in Los Angeles County Superior Court would be televised and analyzed for months. Guinness World Records lists the O.J. Simpson trial as the most viewed trial, with a daily average of 5.5 million Americans watching live coverage on three major cable networks between January 24 and October 3, 1995. But the chase came first. It taught the country how this case would be consumed, not quietly, not locally, and not only through written reports. It would be watched together. The deeper tensions were already present before opening statements, before the glove became a national phrase, before the verdict split public opinion. Domestic violence was part of the larger conversation surrounding Nicole Brown Simpson's death, and Britannica connects the aftermath of her killing with increased public awareness of domestic abuse and with calls and donations to shelters for battered women. Race and policing were also part of the atmosphere. Los Angeles was only 2 years removed from the unrest that followed the acquittal of 4 white law enforcement officers in connection with the videotaped beating of Rodney King, a black motorist. Trust in the LAPD was not an abstract issue. It was recent, visible, and deeply contested. That context helps explain why the case could not remain only a question of forensic evidence or courtroom strategy. It became a story about institutions, police, courts, television networks, celebrity culture, and the unequal ways Americans interpreted authority. Later polling would show sharp racial divisions in reactions to the verdict. Those divisions did not appear from nowhere. They were rooted in different histories of policing, different experiences of justice, and different understandings of what fame and wealth could do inside the legal system. But on the evening of June 17th, all of that was still ahead. The trial had not yet begun. The criminal verdict was more than a year away. The later civil judgment, which found Simpson liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, was further still. What existed in that moment was a moving image, the white Ford Bronco, police units behind it, helicopters above it, crowds forming near the freeway, and a national audience watching a murder suspect who had once been welcomed into American living rooms return to those same living rooms under entirely different circumstances. The chase became the gateway event because it made the case unavoidable. It fixed a symbol in public memory before the courtroom could organize the facts. It turned Brentwood, Los Angeles, and the Southern California freeway system into a national stage. It showed how quickly television could convert a legal emergency into a collective ritual of watching, waiting, and interpreting. And yet the spectacle began somewhere much quieter than the freeway. Before the helicopters, before the overpasses, before the slow pursuit that held millions in place, there was a crime scene outside a home at 875 South Bundy Drive. 2 people were dead. Their names were Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Every public event that followed began there. The freeway spectacle began with a still point, a walkway outside a Brentwood home at 875 South Bundy Drive. That address would become part of the public record, repeated in news reports and court coverage, but before it became shorthand for a famous case, it was simply where Nicole Brown Simpson lived. On June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were killed outside that home. Everything that followed in the O.J. Simpson case rested on that fact. The chase, the helicopters, the televised trial, the arguments over race and policing, the arguments over celebrity and wealth, the later legal outcomes, the endless replay of images and phrases, none of it began with television. It began with 2 deaths in Brentwood, Los Angeles. Nicole Brown Simpson was dead. Ronald Goldman was dead. The case that would soon become known as the trial of the century was first a double homicide investigation. That distinction matters because the public memory of this case is crowded with symbols. The white Ford Bronco, the freeway overpasses, the courtroom, the lawyers, the verdict. The split-screen broadcasts and expert panels. Over time, those images became so dominant that they could almost push the victims to the edge of the story. But the legal machinery, the media machinery, and the national conversation all formed around the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Nicole Brown Simpson's name was already linked publicly to O.J. Simpson's. She had been married to him. He was one of the most recognizable figures in American popular culture, a former football star who had also worked as an actor, broadcaster, and advertising personality. His image had been built through the same television culture that would later carry the chase and the trial into millions of homes. Ronald Goldman was not famous in that way. His name entered the national conversation because he was killed outside Brown Simpson's home on South Bundy Drive. In the record of the case, he stands not as a symbol or a supporting figure, but as one of the two victims whose deaths brought the criminal process into motion. His family, like Nicole Brown Simpson's family, would later continue to pursue justice beyond the criminal trial in civil court. The location also shaped how the case was understood. Brentwood carried its own meanings. It was a Los Angeles neighborhood associated with wealth, privacy, and proximity to celebrity. It was not the kind of place many viewers associated with violent crime scenes. That contrast became part of the early shock of the case. The address, the victims, and the suspect all existed inside a world that seemed, to the national audience, both privileged and exposed. But the confirmed foundation remains narrow and grave. On June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were killed outside Brown Simpson's Brentwood home. On June 17th, O.J. Simpson was arrested and charged with the two murders. Between those two dates, the case moved from a crime scene to a national crisis. And by the end of June 17th, the white Bronco pursuit had made the investigation impossible to separate from live television. That transformation can distort the scale of what came first. A murder investigation is built around victims, evidence, charges, and legal process. A television event is built around images, suspense, narration, and audience attention. In the Simpson case, those two systems collided almost immediately. The deaths at Bundy Drive initiated the case. Simpson's fame changed the size of the public response. Television changed the rhythm of public attention. The families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were forced to live inside that collision. Their loss became part of a national story, but it was not only a national story. It was a private catastrophe that unfolded under extraordinary public conditions. The later court history shows how long that pursuit continued. Simpson pleaded not guilty in the criminal case and was acquitted by a criminal jury on October 3, 1995. A separate civil trial in 1997 found him liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman and ordered him to pay $33.5 million in damages to their families. Those two outcomes are often mentioned together because they reveal something important about the American legal system. A criminal trial and a civil trial operate under different legal standards and can produce different results. In the criminal case, the jury found Simpson not guilty. In the civil case, he was found liable. For the families, the civil judgment was another route through the courts after the criminal verdict. For the public, it complicated any simple ending to the story. But in this chapter, before the courtroom expands, before the lawyers become public figures, before the verdict divides opinion, the focus has to stay on Bundy Drive. The reason is not just moral, it is structural. If the chase is treated as the beginning, the case becomes a television story first and a murder case second. If the trial is treated as the beginning, the story becomes a courtroom drama before it becomes an account of two lives lost. The correct order is quieter and harder to sensationalize. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were killed. Their deaths started the case. This is where the tension at the center of the episode begins. The facts of the killings were local and specific. Two victims, one Brentwood address, one date. The public machinery that formed around them was national and enormous. Simpson's celebrity meant that reporters, police, lawyers, and viewers were not responding to an unknown suspect. They were responding to a figure already familiar to the country. That familiarity carried its own force. People felt they knew him or knew the image of him. Television had helped create that image, and television would soon help dismantle it. The result was a case that could never remain only in the courthouse. It became a national argument about domestic violence because Nicole Brown Simpson's death contributed to a broader public reckoning over abuse that had too often been treated as private. Britannica connects the aftermath of her death with increased awareness of domestic abuse and with calls and donations to shelters for battered women. That response belongs to the wider meaning of the case, but it begins with the recognition that a woman was killed outside her home. It also became a case about race and policing, not because those issues began on Bundy Drive, but because the investigation and trial unfolded in Los Angeles only 2 years after the unrest that followed the acquittal of 4 white law enforcement officers connected to the videotaped beating of Rodney King, a black motorist. That background would later shape how many viewers interpreted police evidence, LAPD credibility, and courtroom strategy. But again, those arguments came after the murders. They formed around the case. They did not replace the dead. This is the discipline the story requires. The Simpson case can be told through television history, legal history, racial history, celebrity history, and media history. It belongs to all of those categories. But each of them can become a way of moving too quickly past Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The record asks for a slower beginning. Not because the later spectacle is unimportant, but because it was built on a crime. By June 17th, the machinery was already accelerating. Simpson had been charged with the murders. His surrender was expected. Lawyers were involved. Police and prosecutors were preparing for a public process already, unlike ordinary procedure, because the suspect was already famous. The space between Bundy Drive and the Bronco chase was only a matter of days, but in those days, the case shifted from homicide investigation to public drama. Before the white Ford Bronco appeared on Southern California freeways, before viewers watched police follow it across familiar roads, before the country became an audience waiting to see whether Simpson would surrender, there was the legal fact that made the chase possible. O.J. Simpson was wanted in connection with the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The question on June 17th was supposed to be procedural. He was expected to turn himself in. Instead, the procedure broke down. And when it did, a murder case rooted in a Brentwood crime scene began moving toward live national television. By the morning of June 17, 1994, the case had entered a narrow procedural corridor. O.J. Simpson was expected to surrender. The legal machinery was moving in a recognizable direction: charges, lawyers, police custody, arraignment, and the public beginning of a criminal case. But that corridor depended on one crucial act. Simpson had to appear. He did not. That failure changed the meaning of the day before the white Ford Bronco was visible to the country. The chase would later become the remembered image, but the public crisis began earlier, in the gap between what law enforcement expected and what actually happened. In that gap, a famous man accused of murder was no longer simply a defendant preparing to enter the court system. He became, in the words announced by police, a fugitive. The timing mattered. At 1:50 in the afternoon, LAPD Commander David Gascon publicly announced that Simpson had not surrendered and was considered a fugitive. It was a short statement in the larger history of the case, but it marked a major turn. Until then, the public could still imagine the day as a managed, legal transition. Simpson's lawyer, Robert Shapiro, had been involved in surrender negotiations. There was an expectation that the process would be controlled, that the suspect would be brought into custody without a public search, and that the next stage would move into the courthouse. Instead, the authorities were now telling Los Angeles and soon the country that O.J. Simpson was missing. That announcement did not land in a vacuum. Simpson was not an anonymous suspect whose absence would be treated as routine. He was one of the most recognizable public figures in the United States, a former football star whose fame had moved into acting, broadcasting, and advertising. His face had already belonged to television long before the case. Now television, radio, and print news were being asked to absorb a startling contradiction. The same celebrity image that had made Simpson familiar to millions was now attached to a double murder charge and a failed surrender. For law enforcement, this created an immediate practical problem. A suspect charged in the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman had not appeared when expected. Police had to locate him. Prosecutors had to signal that this was not a private matter to be mediated by reputation, friendship, or fame. The public had to understand that helping Simpson avoid arrest could carry criminal consequences. Los Angeles County District Attorney Gil Garcetti made that point plainly. He warned that anyone helping Simpson flee could be prosecuted as a felon. The warning was not just a legal formality. It was a message to the circle around Simpson and to the wider public watching the case develop in real time. Celebrity did not suspend the authority of the courts. Friendship did not create a safe harbor. If a person assisted Simpson in avoiding surrender, Garcetti was saying that assistance could itself become a crime. The warning also revealed something about the pressure gathering around the search. This was not only a matter of finding one person. It was a test of public authority in a city where police credibility, race, wealth, and celebrity already carried heavy meanings. Los Angeles had been through years of scrutiny and unrest surrounding law enforcement, most visibly after the videotaped beating of Rodney King and the acquittals that led to the 1992 Los Angeles riots. The Simpson case had not yet become the trial that would divide public opinion so sharply, but the background was already there. Every official action would be watched anew. Every statement would be interpreted. Robert Shapiro's role during these hours belonged to that fragile space between private negotiation and public accountability. As Simpson's lawyer, Shapiro was connected to the expected surrender process. In ordinary criminal procedure, a defense lawyer can help arrange a client's appearance, communicate with prosecutors, and prevent unnecessary confrontation. But on June 17th, the ordinary channels were breaking down. What had been expected to happen quietly, or at least in an orderly public way, was now becoming uncertain. The lawyer's role could not keep the crisis contained. As afternoon moved toward evening, another scene added to the sense that the legal process had slipped into something more volatile. At a 5 o'clock press conference, Robert Kardashian, Simpson's longtime friend, read a letter from Simpson. Kardashian was not yet the kind of public figure his family name would later become in American media culture. In that moment, he appeared as a close friend standing before cameras, giving voice to Simpson's written words while Simpson himself was absent. The image was unsettling because it inverted the expected order of the day. The public had expected to see Simpson in custody. Instead, they saw his friend reading a letter. The person at the center of the case was not present, yet his voice entered the room through someone else. It was a legal crisis, but it had the emotional structure of a personal farewell. That is part of why these hours before the Bronco are essential to the story. The chase did not suddenly turn a normal day into spectacle. The spectacle was already forming around absence, delay, uncertainty, and televised statements from officials and intimates. Kardashian's reading of the letter intensified the sense that this was not only a fugitive search. It was a moment of instability around a man whose life had been built in public view. The authorities were speaking in the language of charges, surrender, custody, and prosecution. Simpson's circle was speaking through negotiation, friendship, and a letter. The media was carrying both kinds of speech outward, turning them into a shared public experience before anyone had seen the Bronco on a freeway. This is where fame altered the mechanics of crime reporting. In many cases, a missed surrender would become a police matter, reported after the fact or in limited updates. Here, the failure itself became news. Simpson's absence had weight because his presence had been so familiar. Viewers and listeners could picture him. They knew his public persona. They knew the commercials, the broadcasts, the athletic legend. That recognition gave the search an immediate dramatic force. It made the question, "Where is he?" feel national almost as soon as it was local. And still, beneath the public fascination, the legal reason remained fixed. Simpson was wanted in connection with the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The case was not about fame in the abstract. It was about two deaths and the state's attempt to bring a charged suspect into custody. The danger of the afternoon was that spectacle could begin to pull attention away from the victims and toward the famous man who had not surrendered. That tension would follow the case through the chase, the trial, the verdict, and the civil judgment years later. By late afternoon, the day had acquired a strange, suspended quality. Officials had declared Simpson a fugitive. The district attorney had warned that assistance in flight could be treated as a felony. Robert Shapiro's surrender negotiations had not produced the expected outcome. Robert Kardashian had read Simpson's letter before cameras. Law enforcement was searching. Newsrooms were watching. The public was being drawn into the story, not through courtroom testimony, but through the breakdown of procedure. This was the last phase before the case became a moving image. The Bronco had not yet entered the national imagination. It was not yet the symbol it would become, a white vehicle moving slowly through Southern California, surrounded by police, tracked by helicopters, watched by millions. But all the elements that would make that image powerful were already in place. The accused man was famous. The charges were grave. The city was alert. The cameras were ready. The law had asked for surrender, and surrender had not come. Then the search began to find a direction. Simpson's location would be traced from a cellular phone call to the Santa Ana Freeway near Lake Forest in Orange County. The public crisis that had started with a missed surrender was about to become visible on the road. The search that had been abstract for most of the afternoon now had a point on a map. According to the Los Angeles Times timeline, Simpson's location was traced from a cellular phone call to the Santa Ana Freeway near Lake Forest in Orange County. That detail matters because it shows the case shifting from press conference language into law enforcement movement. Until then, the public had heard that O.J. Simpson had not surrendered. They had heard LAPD Commander David Gascon describe him as a fugitive. They had heard warnings from District Attorney Gil Garcetti about anyone helping him flee. They had seen Robert Kardashian read a letter that sounded, to many watching, like something darker than a legal statement. But a freeway location changed the shape of the crisis. It meant Simpson was not only missing, he was moving. The vehicle was a white Ford Bronco. At the wheel was Al Cowlings, Simpson's longtime friend and former football teammate. Simpson was inside the vehicle. What had been a search for a famous defendant now became fixed to a single object, a white sport utility vehicle moving through Southern California traffic, followed by police, watched from above, and soon recognized across the country. The Bronco was not yet the historical symbol it would become. At first, it was simply the vehicle in which law enforcement believed Simpson was traveling. But live television has a way of turning ordinary objects into national images. A house becomes a scene. A courthouse becomes a stage. A freeway becomes a corridor of suspense. On June 17, 1994, the white Ford Bronco became all of those things at once. The Los Angeles Times timeline places the beginning of the California Highway Patrol pursuit at 5:56 in the evening. The time is important because it locates the chase in the narrow space between the late afternoon press conference and the evening news. Earlier that day, the public crisis had been verbal: announcements, legal statements, questions, and uncertainty. By 5:56, it had become visual. Police units were following the Bronco. News helicopters would make the scene legible from the air. Television stations had an image that could be carried live. But the word chase can mislead. In ordinary police footage, a chase suggests speed, evasive driving, sudden turns, and the danger of collision. The Bronco pursuit was something else. It was slow. It was tense. It unfolded less like a pursuit designed to stop a fleeing driver, and more like a moving negotiation, with law enforcement trying to contain danger without provoking catastrophe. That difference was central to why the event held viewers so tightly. The public was not watching a high-speed escape. They were watching a procession. The Bronco moved along the freeway while police followed. The pace allowed the scene to stretch, and because it stretched, it created a strange kind of suspense. There was time to understand who was inside, time to repeat the names, time to explain the charges, time to cut away and return, time for viewers to call other people and say that Simpson had been found, that the Bronco was on television, that the whole thing was happening live. Inside that slow movement was a fear that made the pursuit different from familiar crime coverage. The Associated Press later described Simpson as being in the back of Cowlings' white Ford Bronco with a gun to his head. That reported detail changed the tactical meaning of the scene. Law enforcement was not only dealing with an accused murder suspect who had failed to surrender. They were also dealing with the possibility that Simpson might harm himself. That possibility helps explain the restraint visible in the pursuit. Police could not treat the Bronco only as a vehicle to be stopped. They had to think about public safety on the freeway, the safety of the officers, the role of Al Cowlings as the driver, and the threat to Simpson himself. A sudden maneuver could have ended the movement, but it could also have escalated the risk. So the pursuit became a careful following, a pressure held at a distance. Al Cowlings' presence gave the scene another layer. He was not a stranger. He was not an anonymous accomplice in the public imagination. He was Simpson's longtime friend and former football teammate, a man linked to Simpson through years before the murder case, before the charges, before the national spectacle. His role was not the role of the accused, but the role of the person driving the vehicle that carried the accused. That made the Bronco feel less like a stolen car fleeing police and more like a private crisis moving through public space. The vehicle itself became a kind of sealed room. Viewers could see the exterior clearly: white body, dark windows, steady motion, police cars behind it. But the emotional center of the story was hidden inside. Simpson was visible mostly through reports, not through direct access. Cowlings was driving, but the full conversation in the vehicle was not something the television audience could hear. That gap between what could be seen and what could not be known created the atmosphere of the chase. Everyone could watch the Bronco. No one outside it could fully know what would happen inside it. This was one reason the image became so powerful. It showed almost nothing dramatic in the usual sense, and yet it suggested everything. The Bronco did not need to speed for the country to feel the danger. Its slow movement made the danger more intimate. It allowed people to project fear into the stillness of the vehicle. The steady pace gave the event the rhythm of waiting. Television was built for that rhythm. By 1994, live breaking news had the technical ability and the cultural authority to interrupt normal programming and hold a national audience. Helicopter shots could turn local infrastructure into shared imagery. A freeway in Orange County could become the center of attention in living rooms far beyond California. The Broncos' route was local, but the event was no longer only local. Simpson's fame had already made the case national. The live image now gave that national attention a shape. The pursuit also depended on the peculiar geography of Southern California. Freeways there are not just roads. They are part of the region's daily vocabulary, its map of work, wealth, distance, and identity. The Santa Ana Freeway near Lake Forest placed the first visible phase of the pursuit outside the Brentwood world that had defined the case so far. The deaths had been tied to Bundy Drive. Simpson's home was tied to Rockingham Avenue. But now the story was moving through Orange County, on a freeway known to commuters, officers, and news pilots. It was both extraordinary and familiar, a murder case unfolding on the same infrastructure used every day by ordinary drivers. That familiarity made the image even stranger. A white Bronco on a freeway should have been forgettable. On that evening, it became unforgettable because of who was inside and what had happened before it appeared. The vehicle carried the weight of the missed surrender, the murder charges, the press conference, the letter, and the public question of whether Simpson would live long enough to be taken into custody and brought into court. For law enforcement, the Bronco was a moving problem. For television, it was a moving picture. For the public, it became a moving stage. The vehicle held the central characters of the moment, but it also gathered around itself the institutions that would define the larger case: police, prosecutors, defense lawyers, news organizations, and an audience already learning to experience the case in real time. Nothing about the scene resolved the charges. It did not answer what had happened at Bundy Drive. It did not preview the evidence that would later be argued in court. It did not explain how race, celebrity, wealth, policing, domestic violence, and media power would collide in the months ahead. But it did something just as consequential for the public memory of the case. It created the image through which millions would first enter the story. At 5:56 in the evening, according to the Los Angeles Times timeline, the California Highway Patrol pursuit began. From that point forward, the case was no longer waiting at a police station for Simpson to surrender. It was moving on the freeway, slowly enough to be followed, slowly enough to be broadcast, slowly enough for the country to gather around the picture. The white Ford Bronco had appeared, and as it continued across Southern California, the pursuit would stretch into something larger than a police operation. About 60 miles of live television carried over freeways, city streets, overpasses, and screens, while a nation watched a famous man's legal crisis move through the evening traffic. By the time the white Ford Bronco became the center of the broadcast, the story had already changed form. It was no longer only an arrest warrant, or a missed surrender, or a press conference in which lawyers and officials tried to explain what had gone wrong. It was motion. It was a vehicle traveling through Southern California, while police followed and helicopters watched from above. The Associated Press would later describe the pursuit as covering about 60 miles of freeways and city streets. That distance is one reason the chase became so fixed in public memory. It did not happen in one brief burst. It stretched. It unfolded across the map slowly enough for stations to join the coverage, for viewers to call one another, for crowds to move toward overpasses, and for the familiar infrastructure of Los Angeles and Orange County to become part of the drama. The route itself was ordinary in a way that made the scene more unsettling. It moved through the freeway system that millions of people in Southern California knew not as spectacle, but as routine. According to the reported route, the Bronco traveled from the Santa Ana 5 freeway to the Artesia 91 freeway and then north on the San Diego 405 freeway in Torrance. These were not remote roads. They were the corridors of workdays, commutes, airport trips, family errands, and weekend movement across the basin. On June 17, 1994, they became the stage for a public crisis. That setting mattered. A police pursuit usually suggests speed. The phrase brings to mind sirens, sharp turns, sudden danger, and tactics meant to end movement as quickly as possible. But this was almost the reverse image. Viewers did not see a high-speed chase in the familiar television sense. They saw a slow procession. The white Bronco moved forward, surrounded by distance and restraint. California Highway Patrol units followed, but the scene did not carry the visible aggression of a chase built around ramming, blocking, or forced surrender. It was controlled, but not resolved. It was quiet, but not calm. That contradiction gave the broadcast its tension. The pursuit did not look violent on the screen, yet everyone watching understood that the circumstances were grave. Simpson had been charged with the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Earlier that afternoon, he had not appeared for his expected surrender. Los Angeles police had publicly described him as a fugitive. Now, instead of appearing in custody through the usual legal sequence, he was inside a Bronco, moving across the region under police watch. The image was simple enough for anyone to understand. A white vehicle, a freeway, police behind it, helicopter footage above it. But the simplicity hid the complexity. Law enforcement was not merely following a suspect. It was managing a situation unfolding live before a national audience. Television was not merely recording the event, it was expanding it. Every mile gave the broadcast more time to gather viewers. Every interchange and lane marker placed the story deeper into the recognizable geography of Southern California. For local viewers, the freeways were not abstractions. The Santa Ana Freeway, the Artesia Freeway, and the San Diego Freeway were part of daily knowledge. To see them from the helicopter's angle was to see a familiar world transformed. The lanes, signs, medians, ramps, and overpasses looked like the everyday city, but they were carrying a national story. The geography helped make the chase feel immediate. It was not happening in a sealed courtroom or behind a police perimeter. It was moving across roads where ordinary life had continued only minutes before. And because it moved slowly, people began to respond in real time. Along the 405 freeway, crowds gathered on roadways and overpasses. Some came to watch. Some appeared to cheer. Some held signs. The research record does not require us to assign one motive to all of them. What matters is the fact of their presence. The broadcast had not only created an audience at home, it had drawn spectators physically into the scene. That was one of the strangest features of the chase. The freeways became both transportation network and public theater. People who would normally be separated from a police operation by distance, by uncertainty, or by lack of access could suddenly locate it. They could hear where the Bronco was. They could see it on television. If they were near the route, they could move toward it. The chase was live in two senses at once, live on screen and live on the pavement beneath the overpasses. The overpass crowds also changed the visual language of the pursuit. From the air, the Bronco was not moving through an empty system. It was moving through a corridor lined with witnesses. The people on the edges of the freeway turned the event into a public gathering, even as the underlying case remained a double murder prosecution. That tension would follow the Simpson case for the rest of its public life. A legal proceeding built around the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman kept becoming a mass event, shaped by fame, media access, and the public's appetite for watching. The slow movement also gave television time to impose rhythm. Helicopters could hold the shot. Anchors could speak over the images. Viewers could enter the story without needing an elaborate explanation. The Bronco's pace made the event legible. There was no blur of speed, no chaotic confusion that ended before people understood what they were seeing. Instead, the pursuit seemed almost suspended in time. The vehicle remained visible. The police remained behind it. The outcome remained unknown. That uncertainty was essential. If the pursuit had ended quickly, it might have been remembered as a dramatic arrest. Because it continued, it became something closer to a national vigil. People watched not just to see where the Bronco would go, but to learn how the crisis would end. Would Simpson surrender? Would police intervene? Would the vehicle stop? The live picture did not answer those questions. It extended them. The Associated Press description of about 60 miles captures the physical scale, but the televised scale was larger. The chase moved across freeways and city streets, but it also moved across living rooms, bars, newsrooms, and control rooms. It moved through network decisions and local station coverage. It interrupted ordinary viewing. It made millions of people share the same unresolved image at the same time. That shared image would become one of the defining media moments of the case. Before the months of courtroom testimony, before the arguments over evidence, police credibility, race, domestic violence, and celebrity justice, the public saw a famous man in flight without the usual visual language of escape. The Bronco did not race away. It did not disappear. It stayed in view. It moved at a pace that made watching feel unavoidable. The route north on the San Diego 405 freeway in Torrance brought the pursuit deeper into the Los Angeles landscape. It was moving toward the west side, toward Brentwood, toward the part of the city already marked by the killings on Bundy Drive and by Simpson's own home on Rockingham Avenue. But during this middle stretch, the destination was still not the point. The point was the suspended passage itself, a murder defendant inside a vehicle, a friend at the wheel, police behind them, and a country looking down from the television sky. The chase had inverted expectation. It had made slowness more gripping than speed. It had turned the freeway system into a stage and spectators into part of the scene. It had taken a legal crisis that began with a missed surrender and stretched it across about 60 miles of public space. But the calm surface of the footage did not mean the situation was simple. Inside the Bronco, according to the Associated Press account, Simpson was in the back of Al Cowlings' white Ford Bronco with a gun to his head. That fact gave the slow pursuit its most dangerous meaning. The police were not only following a vehicle, they were following a moving crisis in which arrest, public safety, friendship, fear, and the possibility of self-harm were all traveling together through the evening traffic. From the air, the white Bronco looked almost orderly. It moved with traffic, not against it. California Highway Patrol units kept behind it. Helicopters held the vehicle in frame. The freeways gave the scene a kind of structure, a path that could be followed on a map. But the most important part of the pursuit was not visible from the helicopter shot. According to the Associated Press, Simpson was in the back of Al Cowlings' white Ford Bronco with a gun to his head. That report changed the meaning of everything viewers were seeing. The low speed was not simply an oddity. The distance between the patrol cars and the Bronco was not just caution. The absence of dramatic police maneuvers was not weakness or confusion. It was part of a situation in which law enforcement had to think about arrest, public safety, and the possibility that Simpson might kill himself while the country watched. That is what made the pursuit different from ordinary police chase footage. A conventional chase often has a familiar grammar. A suspect runs. Police follow. The danger is measured in speed, traffic, collisions, and the possibility of a violent stop. Television can understand that kind of scene quickly because the image explains itself. A car moving fast away from police is a chase. The Bronco pursuit was slower and more difficult to read. Its danger was not in the velocity, its danger was in uncertainty. The vehicle was moving through public space across Southern California freeways and city streets, but the crisis at the center of it was inside the Bronco. The authorities were not only trying to stop a murder suspect, they were trying to keep the event from becoming a public death. That balance shaped the entire pursuit. Police had reason to take Simpson into custody. He had failed to surrender after being charged in the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Earlier that afternoon, LAPD Commander David Gascon had announced that Simpson had not appeared as expected and was a fugitive. The legal direction was clear. Simpson was wanted in connection with 2 murders. But the tactical situation was not simple. A forceful stop could endanger Simpson, Cowlings, police officers, and nearby drivers. A rush toward the vehicle could provoke the very outcome officers were trying to prevent. Waiting carried risks too. The Bronco was still moving. Spectators were gathering along the route. The longer the pursuit continued, the larger the live audience became, and the more fragile the situation seemed. The camera could show the line of vehicles. It could show the freeways, the overpasses, the crowds, the evening light over Los Angeles. But it could not show the calculations being made by officers who had to manage a crisis that was both operational and emotional. The presence of a gun, as reported by the Associated Press, meant this was not only a pursuit. It was a negotiation in motion. The role of Al Cowlings sits at the center of that tension. Cowlings was not the accused murderer in the case. He was Simpson's longtime friend and former football teammate, the man driving the white Ford Bronco while Simpson was in the back. That distinction matters. The public image of the Bronco could easily flatten everyone inside it into one symbol. But the facts make the situation more complicated. Cowlings was the driver of the vehicle. Simpson was the murder suspect. The police were following both men, but the legal and emotional stakes around each of them were not the same. Cowlings's presence also changed the texture of the pursuit. This was not a stolen car driven by a stranger. It was a vehicle driven by someone with a long, personal connection to Simpson. The friendship did not erase the seriousness of the case, and it did not change the deaths at the center of it. But it did help explain why the pursuit felt less like a clean police scenario and more like a private collapse unfolding in public. Millions of viewers were watching a friendship under extreme pressure without being able to hear it. They saw the Bronco, but not the conversation inside it. They saw Cowlings drive, but could not know precisely what he was saying or thinking in each moment. They knew Simpson was inside, but the helicopter view kept him mostly abstract, a presence rather than a face. The result was an unusual kind of suspense. The audience knew enough to be afraid, but not enough to know how the scene would end. This uncertainty helped turn the pursuit into a national suspense event. It was not suspense in the fictional sense, where a story has been shaped toward a climax. It was real-time, unresolved, and unstable. Every minute that passed carried the possibility of a different ending. The Bronco might stop. Simpson might surrender. Police might intervene. A bystander might get too close. The gun might become the final fact of the evening. Television intensified that uncertainty because it made the waiting collective. Viewers were not reading about a standoff after it had ended. They were watching the standoff while the outcome was still unknown. The live broadcast created a shared present tense. The country did not know whether it was witnessing a surrender, an escape attempt, a suicide crisis, or the beginning of an even larger confrontation. This is one reason the chase became so difficult to separate from the later meaning of the case. The criminal trial would eventually become a televised legal event of enormous scale. Guinness World Records lists the O.J. Simpson trial as the most viewed trial, with a daily average of 5.5 million Americans watching live coverage on 3 major cable networks between January 24 and October 3, 1995. But before the trial had its daily rhythm, its lawyers, its evidence arguments, and its courtroom language, the country encountered the case as an unresolved image, a white Bronco moving slowly while police followed at a distance. In that image, different forms of power met each other. There was the power of the state, represented by the LAPD, the California Highway Patrol, prosecutors, warrants, and eventual custody. There was the power of celebrity, because Simpson's fame made the pursuit impossible to treat as an ordinary fugitive case. There was the power of television, which turned the operation into a national experience. And there was the power of uncertainty, because no one outside the Bronco could control the emotional crisis inside it. The pace of the pursuit made that uncertainty harder to escape. Speed can resolve a chase quickly, sometimes violently. Slowness stretches it. It creates time for commentary, speculation, phone calls, crowds, and fear. It allows the audience to settle into the event and then realize there is no safe place to stand inside it. The Bronco was moving slowly enough to watch, but not calmly enough to feel safe. The police were close enough to remind viewers that arrest was coming, but not close enough to make the situation feel contained. For law enforcement, this meant restraint was not passive. It was tactical. Keeping distance could be an action. Avoiding confrontation could be a decision. Letting the Bronco continue toward a controlled endpoint could be part of preventing a worse outcome. The public might have been accustomed to seeing police assert control through speed, blocking, and force. Here, control looked quieter. It looked like following. It looked like patience under pressure. And all the while, the case behind the chase remained unchanged. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman had been killed outside Brown Simpson's Brentwood home on June 12, 1994. Simpson had been charged with their murders on June 17th. The pursuit did not replace those facts, though the spectacle threatened to overwhelm them. Instead, it became the first vast public expression of the legal and emotional storm that followed their deaths. The Bronco's interior was not open to the audience, but the knowledge of what was reportedly happening inside gave the broadcast its emotional weight. A famous man accused of murder was in the back seat. A longtime friend and former teammate was driving. Police were following. A gun was part of the crisis. The route was public, but the decision that mattered most was private, whether the evening would end in custody, violence, or self-destruction. That is why the slow pursuit held the country for hours. It was not because the vehicle moved dramatically. It was because it did not. It stayed just beyond resolution. It remained visible but unknowable. It gave viewers a continuous image while withholding the outcome. Eventually, the movement across the freeways would give way to a more fixed stage. The procession would narrow from Southern California roads to Brentwood streets, and then to Simpson's estate on Rockingham Avenue. But before the Bronco reached that final address, the central tension had already been established. The chase was no longer only about catching a fugitive. It was about whether a live national spectacle could be guided, minute by minute, toward surrender instead of catastrophe. By the time the procession left the freeways and narrowed toward Brentwood, the shape of the crisis had changed again. For nearly 2 hours, the white Bronco had been a moving object watched from the air and followed from behind. It had crossed familiar Southern California pavement, passing through a landscape that millions of viewers could read, even if they had never driven it themselves: lanes, exits, overpasses, patrol cars, evening light. But movement could not last forever. The question that had followed the Bronco from Orange County into Los Angeles now had to be answered in one place. Would the pursuit end in surrender, or would it end as something worse? The final address was Rockingham Avenue, the Brentwood street where O.J. Simpson owned his estate. According to the Los Angeles Times timeline, the Bronco arrived at Simpson's home at 7:57 in the evening on June 17, 1994. That timestamp matters because it corrects the way the chase is often remembered. In public memory, the Bronco arrives, the story ends, and the image dissolves into the larger case. But the records show something slower and more unsettled. Simpson was not in police custody until 8:47. That left nearly 50 minutes between arrival and custody. Nearly 50 minutes in which the chase had stopped moving, but had not yet ended. The driveway became the last stage of the pursuit. For much of the evening, the spectacle had depended on distance. Helicopter cameras watched from above. California Highway Patrol units followed behind. Crowds gathered along the route and on overpasses, close enough to witness, but not close enough to decide anything. Television viewers were farther away still, pulled into the event by a live signal. The Bronco's slow movement gave everyone the sense of being present, but it also kept the central crisis sealed inside the vehicle. At Rockingham Avenue, that distance compressed. The Bronco was no longer a moving symbol crossing the city. It was back at Simpson's house, on his property, surrounded by police attention and national attention at the same time. The estate became a private residence, transformed into public theater. A driveway, ordinarily the most ordinary threshold between street and home, became the place where a fugitive murder suspect had to be brought into custody without violence. That was the central tension of those final minutes. The police already had the destination. The vehicle was no longer disappearing down a freeway or continuing through traffic. Yet the presence of the Bronco at the estate did not remove the danger that had shaped the pursuit. The Associated Press had described Simpson as being in the back of Al Cowlings' white Ford Bronco with a gun to his head. That reported fact meant that every decision at the end had consequences beyond arrest tactics. A rushed conclusion could risk death. Too much delay could prolong uncertainty. The live audience could see the scene from a distance, but the crucial negotiations remained beyond the public's hearing. In that sense, the final stretch of the chase was not a chase in the usual meaning of the word. It was a standoff with cameras. The arrest warrant, the missed surrender, the fugitive announcement, the cellular phone trace, the freeway pursuit, and the return to Brentwood all converged on Rockingham Avenue. Earlier that afternoon, LAPD Commander David Gascon had publicly said that Simpson had not surrendered and was a fugitive. Los Angeles County District Attorney Gil Garcetti had warned that anyone helping Simpson flee could be prosecuted as a felon. Robert Shapiro had been part of the surrender negotiations. Robert Kardashian had read Simpson's letter at a late afternoon press conference. By the time the Bronco reached the estate, the legal and emotional machinery of the day had already been turning for hours. Now it had reached the point where public statements mattered less than the immediate fact of custody. The location also gave the case a grim geographic circle. The killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman had taken place 5 days earlier outside Brown Simpson's Brentwood home at 875 South Bundy Drive. The pursuit ended at Simpson's Brentwood estate on Rockingham Avenue. The two addresses were part of the same West Side landscape, a neighborhood associated with wealth, privacy, celebrity, and proximity to the media industries that helped build Simpson's public image. But the meaning of those addresses was no longer local. Bundy Drive was the place where the case began, with the deaths of two people. Rockingham Avenue was the place where the chase ended, with the arrest of a famous suspect. The distance between them was geographically small compared with the national distance the story had traveled. In less than a week, a double killing in Brentwood had become a case followed across the country. In one evening, a failed surrender had become a live national event. Television took a concentrated Los Angeles geography and expanded it into a shared American experience. That expansion is part of why Rockingham Avenue carries so much weight in the story. It was not only the endpoint of a route. It was the point at which Simpson's personal world, his celebrity world, and the criminal justice system met in full view. His home was no longer a symbol of success or privacy. It was the place where police were waiting. It was the place where the man who had been a football hero, actor, broadcaster, and advertising figure would be taken into custody on murder charges. The contrast was stark. Simpson's fame had long depended on familiarity. Audiences knew his face, his voice, his athletic history, his commercial image. He had been presented to the public as someone recognizable, approachable, and successful. On June 17, 1994, that familiarity made the police event feel intimate to people who had no connection to him. The viewers did not merely watch a suspect arrive at a house. They watched a famous man return to a home that had become part of a national crime story. And still, at Rockingham, the most important fact was not fame. It was custody. According to the Los Angeles Times timeline, Simpson was in police custody by 8:47 that evening. The Associated Press reported that he was captured in his driveway after a pursuit over about 60 miles of freeways and city streets. The word captured carries the finality that the live broadcast had withheld for hours. The uncertainty that had defined the chase narrowed into a legal status. Simpson was no longer only missing, no longer only a fugitive, no longer only a passenger in the back of a Bronco driven by Al Cowlings. He was under arrest. The arrest on June 17, 1994, closed the pursuit but opened the case in its next form. Simpson had been arrested and charged with the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. That charge would move into the courts, into pretrial hearings, into a criminal trial before Judge Lance Ito in Los Angeles County Superior Court, and eventually into one of the most watched legal proceedings in American history. But before the courtroom became the stage, the driveway had been the stage. Before legal arguments became daily programming, the Bronco had been the image. The end of the chase did not erase what had happened earlier in the week. It led back to it. Rockingham Avenue cannot be separated from Bundy Drive. One was the end point of the pursuit. The other was the site of the killings. One held the surrender. The other held the loss. The public spectacle of the Bronco could easily overwhelm the quieter truth that Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were dead, and that their families would continue to seek justice long after the helicopters left Brentwood. That is one of the lasting difficulties of telling this story. The chase is visually simple: a white vehicle, a famous passenger, police cars behind it, helicopters above it, a country watching. The case beneath it is not simple. It includes domestic violence, grief, race, policing, wealth, fame, evidence, law, and trust. It includes the difference between a criminal acquittal and a later civil judgment. It includes a city still shaped by recent conflict over the LAPD and a national audience divided in how it understood police power and legal authority. But on the evening of June 17th, those larger meanings were still gathering. The immediate question was whether the Bronco would stop, whether Simpson would survive the stop, and whether police could bring him in. At 8:47, the pursuit had reached its answer. The image did not disappear when custody began. It hardened into memory. Rockingham Avenue became part of the map of the case, joined to Bundy Drive, the Santa Ana Freeway, the Artesia Freeway, and the San Diego Freeway. The route had ended, but television had already changed what the route meant. A local arrest had become a national ritual of watching. The driveway was the end of the chase, but not the end of the spectacle. By the time Simpson was in custody on Rockingham Avenue, the pursuit itself was over. But the broadcast had done something that could not be undone. It had taken a police matter unfolding across Southern California and made it simultaneous, national, and shared. The white Bronco was no longer only a vehicle in a criminal investigation. It had become an image that millions of people had watched at the same time, with the same uncertainty, waiting for the same ending. Britannica states that the televised attempted escape was seen by an estimated 95 million viewers. That figure matters because it places the chase outside the usual scale of local crime coverage. A murder suspect had failed to surrender. Police had located him. A friend was driving. California Highway Patrol units followed. Those were the immediate facts. But television turned those facts into a collective experience. People did not learn about the chase only after it ended. They watched it happen. That was the crucial shift. The broadcast was not simply a record of the event. It became part of the event's meaning. For viewers, the picture was easy to understand even when the legal and emotional circumstances were not. A white Ford Bronco moved along freeways. Police followed. Helicopters hovered above. The car did not race away. It did not disappear into backstreets. It stayed visible, framed from the air, moving through a landscape of lanes, ramps, overpasses, and evening traffic. The image had almost no visual complexity, and that simplicity gave it power. Even without hearing every detail, a viewer could grasp the essential question: would the vehicle stop, and what would happen when it did? Television often depends on images that can be read instantly. The Bronco chase supplied one. A famous man accused of severe crimes was somewhere inside a moving vehicle. Police were close behind. The outcome was unknown. The camera could not show Simpson's face from the helicopter view, but it did not need to. The story was already attached to his name, his celebrity, and the charges against him. The distance of the aerial shot made the scene strangely impersonal, while the identity of the person inside made it intensely personal for viewers who felt they already knew him. That tension helps explain why the chase held national attention. It was not a high-speed pursuit built on danger at the edges of control. It was slow, contained, and prolonged. It created suspense not through speed, but through waiting. The picture barely changed from minute to minute, yet the meaning of the picture remained unstable. It could become an arrest. It could become a surrender. It could become a death on live television. That uncertainty gave the broadcast its hold. The chase also arrived at a moment when television news had the technical and cultural power to reorganize public attention quickly. National networks and cable channels could interrupt or reshape programming around a live event. Helicopter footage could be distributed and watched as the story developed. Before social media, before online feeds became routine, live television was the place where a shared national screen event could form almost instantly. Viewers were separated in their homes, bars, workplaces, and public spaces, but the screen made them part of the same moment. This is why the chase blurred categories that are usually kept apart. It was breaking news because a fugitive murder suspect was being followed by police. It was celebrity spectacle because the suspect was O.J. Simpson, a former football star, actor, broadcaster, and advertising figure whose public image had already been built through television. It was public ritual because millions watched not only for information, but for resolution. They waited together for an ending that seemed to carry more weight than a routine arrest. The broadcast also exposed a contradiction at the center of televised crime. Television can make an event visible, but visibility is not the same as understanding. Viewers could see the Bronco's route. They could see police vehicles behind it. They could see the crowds that gathered along roadways and overpasses. But they could not see the legal evidence. They could not see the grief of the families in any complete way. They could not see the full history of the relationships involved, or the future courtroom battles that would follow. The image was clear, but the case was not simple. Still, the image carried the story forward. The deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman remained the reason the case existed. Simpson's failure to surrender and the pursuit that followed became the reason the case entered American public memory with such force. Television did not create the criminal charges, but it shaped how the country first experienced them. It introduced the case not through a courtroom, not through a full presentation of evidence, but through pursuit, suspense, and celebrity recognition. That opening mattered for everything that came after. Once the chase had been watched by an estimated 95 million viewers, the case no longer belonged only to police reports, court filings, and legal strategy. It had a mass audience already trained to follow developments in real time. Pre-trial hearings, lawyer statements, courtroom decisions, and evidentiary disputes would not unfold in obscurity. They would be absorbed into a public narrative that television had already intensified. The Bronco chase created the template: watch live, interpret immediately, argue afterward. The criminal trial would later be held in Los Angeles County Superior Court before Judge Lance Ito. It would include prosecutors Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, and defense attorneys Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, Robert Shapiro, and Robert Kardashian. The trial itself ran from January 24, 1995, to the not guilty verdict on October 3, 1995. Guinness World Records list the O.J. Simpson trial as the most viewed trial, with a daily average of 5.5 million Americans watching live coverage on 3 major cable networks during that period. Those numbers show the continuation of the pattern established on June 17th. The chase was not an isolated media anomaly. It was the first mass viewing event in a case that would become one of the defining courtroom broadcasts of the era. Daily testimony became television programming. Legal arguments became material for nightly analysis. Lawyers became public figures. Phrases from the courtroom entered everyday speech. The verdict became not only a legal outcome, but a televised national moment. This did not mean the audience understood the case in one way. The opposite was true. Television brought viewers to the same images, but it did not produce the same interpretation. The case unfolded in a country already divided by race, policing, celebrity, wealth, and trust in institutions. In Los Angeles, the memory of the Rodney King beating and the unrest that followed the acquittal of 4 white law enforcement officers in 1992 remained part of the civic background. For many viewers, questions about the LAPD were not abstract. They were connected to recent history, visible conflict, and long-standing mistrust. Later polling would show how divided public reception became. ABC News polling, archived by ICPSR, asked respondents about the Simpson verdict, perceptions of guilt or innocence, possible police conspiracy, and whether the outcome would have differed if Simpson were white. A Gallup CNN/USA Today poll, summarized by UMKC's Famous Trials Project, found sharp racial differences after the verdict. 78% of black respondents called the verdict right, compared with 42% of white respondents. Those divisions were not created by the Bronco chase alone, but the chase helped create the national stage on which those divisions would later be displayed. Television made the case common property, but not common meaning. It allowed millions to say they had seen the same thing, while leaving open what that thing represented. To some, the chase looked like the fall of a beloved public figure accused of unbearable violence. To others, it looked like the beginning of another high-profile criminal case shaped by police power, media pressure, and unequal trust. To many, it was both: a human tragedy, a celebrity collapse, and a legal crisis, all compressed into one moving picture. The power of the Bronco image also came from what it left unresolved. It did not explain domestic violence, though the case would contribute to increased public attention to domestic abuse after Nicole Brown Simpson's death. Britannica connects the aftermath of her death with increased awareness and with calls and donations to shelters for battered women. It did not explain the criminal trial, which would end in acquittal. It did not explain the later civil trial, where Simpson was found liable in 1997 and ordered to pay $33.5 million in damages to the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The chase explained none of that fully, but it fixed the public's attention so firmly that all of those later developments would be watched through the memory of that first live spectacle. That is the deeper meaning of the broadcast. It did not merely show a famous suspect moving through Los Angeles. It transformed a structure of public attention around the case. The camera made the freeway into a stage. The helicopter shot made distance feel intimate. The uninterrupted waiting made viewers participants in a ritual of uncertainty. And once that ritual happened, the case could not return to being ordinary, even for a moment. The white Bronco became a symbol because it was simple enough to remember and complicated enough to argue over. It carried a murder defendant, but also a public persona built over decades. It moved through real roads, but it also moved through American ideas about fame, race, policing, violence, and television itself. The broadcast became the story because the story was now inseparable from being watched. And at the center of that watching was a fact that would shape every stage that followed. Viewers were not seeing an unknown man. They were seeing O.J. Simpson, someone television had already taught them to recognize. Television had already taught viewers how to recognize him, and that recognition changed the meaning of every image that followed. The white Bronco was not watched only because a suspect was inside it. It was watched because the suspect had spent years as a public figure, moving through football, acting, broadcasting, and advertising before he moved, slowly and silently, through the freeways of Southern California. That is one of the reasons the chase felt both intimate and unreal. For many viewers, O.J. Simpson was not introduced to them by a police bulletin. He was not first seen in a courtroom sketch or a booking photograph. He had entered American homes long before June 17, 1994, through screens that made fame feel familiar. By the time LAPD Commander David Gascon announced that Simpson had not surrendered and was a fugitive, the public already knew his face, his name, and the broad outline of his celebrity life. This did not make the charges less serious. Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman had been killed outside Brown Simpson's Brentwood home on June 12, 1994. Simpson was arrested and charged with the two murders on June 17th. Those facts are the center of the case, but fame changed the scale of the public reaction. It changed the speed with which the story spread. It changed the emotional shock of the accusation. It changed the way millions of viewers processed the sight of police following a white Ford Bronco with Simpson inside. A criminal case involving an unknown defendant can become important because of the evidence, the victims, the legal questions, or the failures of institutions. This case had all of those dimensions. But it also had something else from the start, a defendant whose image had already been produced and repeated by mass media. Simpson's celebrity meant that the public did not come to the story empty. Viewers arrived with memories, impressions, loyalties, suspicions, and disbelief already in place. That prior familiarity mattered. It made the case feel personal to people who had no personal connection to the victims, the defendant, Brentwood, the Los Angeles Police Department, or the Los Angeles County Courts. A famous face can create a false closeness. People may feel they know someone because they have seen him many times. They may feel surprised by an accusation, not only because the accusation is grave, but because it collides with an image they have carried for years. Simpson's fame had been built for the camera. He was a former NFL star, and athletic fame often depends on repeated public witnessing, the body in motion, the performance seen again and again, the name attached to moments of victory or spectacle. After football, his public life extended into acting, broadcasting, and advertising. Each of those roles depends on visibility. Each asks the audience to accept a version of the person presented on screen. By June 17th, that version of Simpson had become part of the national background. He was not only known in sports, pages, or by courtroom reporters. He belonged to a broader entertainment and media world, one in which celebrity could travel across formats. A football figure could become an actor. An actor could become a broadcaster. A broadcaster could become an advertising presence. The same face could appear in different contexts until recognition itself became a kind of power. That power was not legal power in the formal sense. It did not erase the charges. It did not decide what evidence would be admitted or what verdict a jury would reach. But it influenced attention. It determined whether television treated the developing events as more than a local murder case. It helped turn a missed surrender into a national crisis. It helped explain why a slow pursuit, beginning after Simpson's location was traced from a cellular phone call to the Santa Ana Freeway near Lake Forest in Orange County, could become a shared screen event watched across the country. Celebrity also shaped interpretation. The same image can mean different things depending on who is inside it. A white Ford Bronco moving slowly down a freeway might ordinarily read as a police operation, a public safety issue, or a local breaking news event. With Simpson inside, it became a collision between two public identities, the familiar celebrity and the accused murder defendant. Viewers were watching law enforcement try to bring in a man they already associated with fame. That tension gave the image its strange force. The chase did not look like the usual action sequence associated with police pursuits. The Associated Press described Simpson as being in the back of Al Cowlings' white Ford Bronco with a gun to his head. California Highway Patrol units followed or crewed. The pace was slow. The stakes were immediate. The fear of suicide was part of the drama. And all of this was being broadcast to a public that had been trained by television to understand Simpson as someone visible, successful, and known. That is why the case became so hard to separate from the machinery of fame. The Bronco was a vehicle, but it also became a moving frame around a public persona in collapse. The freeway was real, but it also operated like a stage. The helicopter shot gave viewers distance and intimacy at the same time. They could not hear the full conversations, and they could not control the outcome, but they could watch. The famous man was near and unreachable, familiar and suddenly unknowable. The emotional shock was intensified by the gap between image and allegation. The charges were not abstract. They concerned the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Yet the public spectacle often pulled attention back toward the figure of Simpson himself. That is one of the uncomfortable truths of celebrity crime coverage. Fame can enlarge a case while also distorting its center of gravity. It can bring vast attention to violence, courts, and victims' families. It can also turn the accused into the central image around which the story circulates. In this case, the circulation became enormous. Britannica states that the televised attempted escape was seen by an estimated 95 million viewers. Later, the courtroom phase would become another landmark in televised legal culture. Guinness World Records lists the O.J. Simpson trial as the most viewed trial, with a daily average of 5.5 million Americans watching live coverage on 3 major cable networks between January 24 and October 3, 1995. That later audience did not emerge from nowhere. The chase helped establish the case as something to be followed continuously, interpreted publicly, and discussed as a national event. Simpson's fame made that continuity possible. Viewers had a reason, or thought they had a reason, to keep watching. The name carried cultural weight before the evidence was argued in court. It gave the case a built-in audience. It also gave commentators, anchors, and analysts a figure around whom to organize larger questions. What happens when celebrity meets criminal accusation? What does wealth do inside the legal system? How does television turn legal process into public drama? How does a familiar image survive, fracture, or harden under the pressure of violence? The answers were not simple, and the case became a place where people brought their own experiences of American institutions. Some saw a fallen celebrity. Some saw a prosecution. Some saw a defendant with unusual resources. Some saw a black man accused by a system they did not trust. Some focused on the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, and on the history of domestic violence brought into public discussion after Brown Simpson's death. Fame did not replace these meanings. It intensified them and made them visible to a larger audience. That is the connection between celebrity and power in this story. Power is not only the authority to arrest, charge, prosecute, defend, or judge. It is also the power to command attention. Simpson's public persona had that kind of power. It pulled cameras toward him. It made networks stay with the image. It made viewers feel that something historic was unfolding, even before the trial began. It ensured that a local geography, Bundy Drive, Rockingham Avenue, the Santa Ana Freeway, the Artesia Freeway, and the San Diego Freeway would become part of a national memory. But celebrity did not operate alone. It entered a city already shaped by conflict over race, policing, and public trust. The Simpson case unfolded in Los Angeles only 2 years after the unrest that followed the acquittal of 4 white law enforcement officers connected to the videotaped beating of Rodney King, a black motorist. That context did not make the cases the same. It did mean that when Simpson's fame collided with murder charges, the public was not watching in a vacuum. The cameras had found a celebrity story, but beneath it was a city where the meaning of police evidence, institutional credibility, and race was already under strain. Celebrity made the Simpson case larger, but Los Angeles gave it a deeper and more contested meaning. The cameras had followed a famous man through familiar freeways and into a Brentwood driveway, but the city around that image was not neutral ground. It was a city still living with recent memories of a different video, a different police story, and a different national reckoning. Only 2 years before the Bronco chase, Los Angeles had erupted after the acquittal of 4 white law enforcement officers connected to the videotaped beating of Rodney King, a black motorist. The beating itself took place in March of 1991. The acquittals came on April 29, 1992. What followed was days of unrest in Los Angeles, an event that became one of the defining American urban crises of the early 1990s. That history did not make the Rodney King case and the Simpson murder case the same. They were not the same in facts, charges, victims, or legal questions. Rodney King was a black motorist beaten by officers in an incident captured on video. The Simpson case began with the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman outside Brown Simpson's Brentwood home. O.J. Simpson was a celebrity defendant charged with 2 murders. The evidence, the courtroom arguments, and the human losses belonged to their own case. But the timing mattered. The Simpson case entered public life in Los Angeles only 2 years after the King-related acquittals and the unrest that followed. That meant the police department, the courts, and the language of evidence were already being viewed through a strained public lens. For many viewers, especially those who had watched the Rodney King video and then watched the officers acquitted, police credibility was not an abstract issue. It was tied to images, institutions, and lived experience. For others, the unrest itself had reinforced fears about disorder, crime, and social fracture. The same city could hold sharply different memories of the same recent history. This is one reason the Simpson trial became more than a criminal proceeding in the public imagination. It was formally a murder trial in Los Angeles County Superior Court before Judge Lance Ito, with prosecutors Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, and a defense team that included Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, Robert Shapiro, and Robert Kardashian. But outside the courtroom, it also became a referendum on whether the Los Angeles Police Department could be trusted, whether physical evidence would be believed, and whether race shaped the way Americans interpreted guilt, innocence, and official power. The prosecution's case depended in part on the work of police investigators and the handling of evidence. The defense, in turn, challenged the credibility of that process. In a different city or in a different decade, those arguments might still have been powerful. In Los Angeles after Rodney King, they carried an additional charge. The question was not only what evidence existed, it was who collected it, who interpreted it, and whether the institutions presenting it had earned public trust. That distinction is important. A trial is supposed to turn on evidence introduced in court, legal standards, and the burden of proof. A criminal jury is asked whether guilt has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But the public watches a trial from outside that legal frame. Viewers bring memory, politics, fear, loyalty, suspicion, and personal history. By the time the Simpson trial began in January of 1995, many people were not just watching lawyers argue. They were watching a city's unresolved questions reappear in a courtroom. The Rodney King beating had already shown the power of recorded images. A videotape could travel through television and become a national point of reference. It could make a local act visible to millions. But the aftermath also showed that seeing did not guarantee agreement. People could watch the same footage and still divide over what it meant, what the law required, and whether justice had been done. That lesson hung over Los Angeles as the Simpson case moved from chase to trial. The Bronco chase had its own image language: helicopters, freeways, police cars, crowds on overpasses, a white Ford Bronco moving slowly through Southern California. But the trial that followed asked viewers to interpret a different set of images and claims: crime scene evidence, courtroom demonstrations, police testimony, cross-examinations, and daily legal analysis. Television carried all of it outward. The same medium that had made the chase a national event now turned legal procedure into a continuing public ritual. And because the case involved the LAPD, the meaning of police testimony was not confined to the details of one investigation. For many viewers, the department arrived in the courtroom with a recent public history. The unrest after the King-related acquittals had made policing in Los Angeles a national subject. It had forced questions about race, force, accountability, and credibility into the open. When the Simpson defense challenged police conduct and evidence, those arguments did not fall into silence. They landed in a city and a country already primed to hear them. This helps explain why public reaction to the verdict later appeared so sharply divided. Polling archived in the period after the verdict asked respondents not only about guilt or innocence, but also about the possibility of police conspiracy and whether the outcome would have differed if Simpson were white. A Gallup CNN/USA Today poll, summarized by the University of Missouri-Kansas City's Famous Trials Project, found a stark racial divide. 78% of black respondents called the verdict right, compared with 42% of white respondents. Those numbers do not tell every individual story. They do not mean all black Americans thought one way or all white Americans thought another. But they do show that the verdict was received through different collective experiences. For some, acquittal represented reasonable doubt in a case touched by mistrust of police. For others, it represented the failure of a justice system to hold a famous man accountable. The divide was not created only by the evidence. It was shaped by race, memory, celebrity, class, and the recent history of Los Angeles policing. The danger in telling this history is flattening it. The Simpson case should not be reduced to race alone. It was also about the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, about celebrity power, about media saturation, about legal strategy, about wealth, and about the standard of proof in a criminal trial. Nor should the Rodney King case be treated simply as background color for another story. It was its own profound moment in Los Angeles history, tied to police violence, videotape, acquittal, and unrest. But placing the two moments near each other in time helps explain the atmosphere in which the Simpson trial unfolded. The city had recently seen how differently Americans could interpret police violence and courtroom outcomes. It had seen how television could make a local event national. It had seen how legal decisions could ignite public anger far beyond the courthouse. When Simpson's case arrived, those lessons were still fresh. This was the Los Angeles beneath the spectacle, a city of celebrity neighborhoods and freeway images, but also a city marked by contested policing and racial distrust. Brentwood, Rockingham Avenue, Bundy Drive, and the downtown courthouse existed within the same metropolitan landscape as the memories of March 1991 and April 29, 1992. The geography was not only physical, it was historical. For television audiences, this meant the Simpson case could be watched in more than one way at once. It could be a murder case. It could be a celebrity collapse. It could be a courtroom drama. It could be a test of police credibility. It could be a reflection of racial division in American life. Different viewers emphasized different meanings, and those meanings often collided. That collision would shape the trial's most famous moments and the public's response to its end. But even this larger frame does not exhaust what the case came to represent. Beneath the arguments about police, race, and evidence was another issue that had followed the case from the beginning: violence inside intimate relationships and the difficulty of making that violence visible before it becomes fatal. As the country argued over the LAPD and the courtroom, Nicole Brown Simpson's death also pushed domestic abuse into a national conversation that many had long treated as private. The previous frame was race and policing, and it mattered because the Simpson case unfolded in a city where trust in law enforcement was already deeply contested. But the case also forced another question into public view, one that did not depend on freeway maps, courtroom strategy, or the credibility of the LAPD. It was the question of violence inside intimate relationships, and how often that violence had been treated as private until it could no longer be ignored. Nicole Brown Simpson's death did not enter the national conversation only as part of a celebrity murder case. It also became part of a wider public reckoning with domestic abuse. Britannica connects the aftermath of her death with increased public awareness of domestic abuse and with calls and donations to shelters for battered women. That detail matters because it points beyond the famous names. It suggests that, for many people watching, the case was not simply remote spectacle. It touched something recognizable, something that had existed in many homes and communities without receiving sustained national attention. The public had already been trained to watch the Simpson case through images: the slow white Bronco, the helicopters above Southern California freeways, the crowds on overpasses, the cameras waiting outside Rockingham Avenue. Those images made the case feel immediate. But domestic violence is often not visible in that same way. It does not usually arrive as a live broadcast. It is more likely to be hidden behind family language, private explanations, or the assumption that what happens inside a relationship belongs outside public concern. That is why this part of the story is so important. The murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman began the case, but the public machinery that followed could easily have buried the social issue underneath celebrity. Simpson was already famous through football, acting, broadcasting, and advertising. The chase transformed his failure to surrender into a national television event. The trial would become a daily media institution of its own. In that environment, the danger was that the violence at the center would become just one element in a larger drama of fame, race, lawyers, and television. But Nicole Brown Simpson's death made domestic abuse harder to keep at the margins. Britannica's account of increased calls and donations to shelters for battered women shows how the case reached people who were thinking not only about guilt or innocence, but about danger, protection, and the systems available to victims. The response did not require every viewer to understand the legal evidence in the same way. It reflected a broader recognition that intimate partner violence was not a rare, private tragedy, and that many victims needed help before a crisis became fatal. This was also a moment when American law and policy were changing. The Department of Justice states that the Violence Against Women Act was passed in 1994 to improve legal protections and access to services for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. The law was enacted as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. That timing places the Simpson case near a major federal milestone in how the United States addressed violence against women. The case did not create the issue, and it should not be treated as the sole cause of a national policy shift. But it unfolded in the same year that Congress acted on a broader recognition that domestic violence and sexual assault required legal tools, services, and public attention beyond what had long been available. The significance is not just legislative, it is cultural. Domestic violence had often been minimized by the language of private conflict. The phrase domestic itself can soften the violence it describes, making it sound contained, personal, or separate from public life. But the Simpson case made that separation harder to maintain. A killing outside a Brentwood home became the beginning of a nationally televised legal saga. The country could not watch the chase, the trial, and the surrounding coverage without also confronting the fact that the case began with the death of a woman whose story resonated with a much larger pattern of abuse and fear. Careful narration has to hold two truths at once. The first is that Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were individuals, not symbols. Their deaths should not be reduced to what the case later meant for television, law, race, or public policy. The second is that public cases can expose private failures. When Britannica links Nicole Brown Simpson's death to increased awareness of domestic abuse and to support for shelters, it shows that the reaction moved outward. People saw a famous case and connected it to a broader problem. Some called. Some gave. Some may have recognized danger in their own lives or in the lives of people close to them. That recognition complicates the celebrity spectacle. The chase drew viewers because it was unprecedented television, a famous man, a murder charge, a slow pursuit, and a nation watching in real time. But the domestic violence frame asks a different question. Not why people could not look away, but what they were being forced to see. Beyond the celebrity fall was a more common form of violence, one that did not require fame, wealth, or Brentwood geography. The famous names amplified the story, but the underlying issue was not limited to famous people. The national frame also changed how responsibility was discussed. Domestic violence is not only an individual act, it raises questions about prevention, intervention, legal protection, emergency shelter, and access to services. The Department of Justice's description of the Violence Against Women Act focuses on improving legal protections and access to services for victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Those words are institutional, but they point to urgent practical needs, a place to go, a way to seek help, a system that takes danger seriously before it escalates. In the Simpson case, the public conversation did not move in a straight line. Many viewers were pulled into arguments about evidence, race, police conduct, and legal strategy. Others focused on fame, television, and the strangeness of seeing a former sports hero become the center of a murder prosecution. The domestic violence issue had to compete with all of that. It could be overshadowed by the courtroom's personalities and by the broader conflicts the trial came to represent. Yet, it did not disappear. The shelter calls and donations noted by Britannica suggest that the issue found a route through the spectacle and into public action. That is one of the quieter legacies of the case. It showed how a sensational media event could still carry a serious social meaning, even when that meaning was unevenly understood. The same broadcast culture that risked turning tragedy into entertainment also helped push domestic abuse into a more open national conversation. Viewers who came for the chase were confronted with the reality that the story began not with the Bronco, but with 2 deaths, and with questions about violence that many families and communities already knew too well. By 1994, then, the Simpson case stood at a crossing point. It was a celebrity crisis, a Los Angeles crime story, a racial flashpoint, and a media event. It was also part of a national moment when domestic violence was being named more publicly and addressed more directly through law, services, shelters, and advocacy. To keep that frame in view is not to simplify the case. It is to restore one of its central meanings. Soon, the images would shift again. The freeways and driveways would give way to a courtroom in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Lawyers, witnesses, evidence, and television cameras would sustain the national attention for months. But before the courtroom took over, the case had already forced a question into the open. What happens when violence inside a relationship is no longer treated as private because the whole country is watching? The question at the end of the previous chapter was, what happens when violence inside a relationship is no longer treated as private because the whole country is watching? In the Simpson case, that question did not remain in editorials, shelters, living rooms, or call-in shows. It moved into a courtroom. The freeways and the driveway had created the opening image. The white Ford Bronco had made the case a live national event before a jury heard evidence, before witnesses testified, and before the public learned the rhythms of the trial itself. But after the chase, the center of gravity shifted. The story that had moved through Southern California traffic now settled into Los Angeles County Superior Court before Judge Lance Ito. That shift mattered. A chase can hold the country for an evening. A trial can hold it for months. The criminal trial of O.J. Simpson ran from January 24, 1995 to October 3, 1995, when the jury returned a not guilty verdict. Between those 2 dates, the case became one of the defining television events of the decade. It was no longer only a story of a former football star, actor, broadcaster, and advertising figure accused in the killings of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. It became a daily courtroom broadcast, a sustained national ritual, and a test of how law behaves when fame, race, wealth, policing, domestic violence, and television all enter the same room. The courtroom was a legal forum, but it was also a stage that the public came to know in detail. Viewers learned the names of lawyers as if they were recurring characters in a long-running drama. On the prosecution side were Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden. They represented the state in a case that had already been shaped by extraordinary attention before opening statements began. Their task was not only to present evidence to a jury, but to do so inside a media atmosphere that had been building since the murders at Bundy Drive and the pursuit to Rockingham Avenue. On the defense side were attorneys whose names became just as familiar: Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, Robert Shapiro, and Robert Kardashian. Shapiro had already been visible during the surrender negotiations on June 17, 1994, when Simpson was expected to turn himself in and did not. Kardashian, Simpson's longtime friend, had already appeared before the cameras that same day when he read Simpson's letter at a 5 o'clock press conference. By the time the trial was underway, the defense team was no longer a private legal circle. It was part of the public architecture of the case. The presence of these figures helped transform courtroom procedure into national narrative. In ordinary criminal trials, lawyers argue, judges rule, witnesses testify, and juries deliberate largely outside the attention of millions. Here, those same legal mechanisms unfolded under an extraordinary gaze. Judge Lance Ito presided over a trial that was being watched, interpreted, and debated far beyond the courthouse. The courtroom became a place where legal meaning and public meaning were constantly overlapping. Guinness World Records lists the O.J. Simpson trial as the most viewed trial, citing a daily average of 5.5 million Americans watching live coverage on 3 major cable networks between January 24th and October 3rd, 1995. That figure helps explain the scale of the event. The chase had been a burst of live television, a spectacle carried by helicopters, breaking news anchors, and freeway crowds. The trial was different. It was repeated exposure. It was morning and afternoon viewing. It was legal testimony turned into household conversation. This was before social media, but it was not before continuous national media. Cable news and courtroom television had created the conditions for a case to be followed almost in real time, day after day. Viewers did not have to wait for a newspaper summary or an evening broadcast. They could watch long stretches of the proceedings live, then watch analysis afterward. The trial became part of the daily schedule of American life. That kind of viewing changed the public relationship to the case. Millions of people were not simply hearing that a lawyer had asked a question or that a witness had answered it. They were watching tone, posture, hesitation, confidence, objection, and reaction. The law became visual. And because the Simpson case was already charged with celebrity, racial division, distrust of police, and concern over domestic violence, every courtroom exchange could carry meanings beyond its narrow legal purpose. This is one reason the trial sustained the spectacle that the chase began. The Bronco pursuit had asked one immediate question: how would this standoff end? The courtroom asked a slower question: what would the system prove and who would believe it? The trial also compressed larger American conflicts into a visible space. Previous chapters have traced why the Los Angeles setting mattered. The case unfolded only 2 years after the 1992 unrest that followed the acquittal of 4 white law enforcement officers connected to the videotaped beating of Rodney King, a black motorist. That history did not make the Simpson case the same as the Rodney King case, but it formed part of the background against which many viewers judged police credibility, evidence, and the LAPD. Inside the courtroom, those questions did not disappear. They became part of how the case was understood. At the same time, the death of Nicole Brown Simpson had intensified public attention to domestic abuse at a moment when the Violence Against Women Act had been enacted in 1994 as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. Britannica connects the aftermath of her death with increased public awareness of domestic abuse and with calls and donations to shelters for battered women. That public awareness followed the case into the trial as well, even when the courtroom's formal procedures narrowed the focus to admissible evidence, legal argument, and the burden of proof. This tension is important. A criminal trial has rules. It does not exist to resolve every social argument that gathers around it. It asks whether the prosecution has proved the charged crimes under the standards of criminal law. But the Simpson trial was never experienced only as a technical legal proceeding. To the public, it also became a debate over wealth and access, race and policing, celebrity and accountability, violence and disbelief. The courtroom could not contain all those meanings, but television made sure they remained attached to every day of testimony. The lawyers themselves became part of that meaning. Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden were not merely names on court filings. They became nationally recognized prosecutors under immense scrutiny. Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, Robert Shapiro, and Robert Kardashian were not merely defense attorneys. They became public figures in their own right. Their arguments, choices, and courtroom styles were absorbed into the media's daily narration of the case. The trial's length deepened that effect. From late January to early October, the proceedings occupied a long stretch of public time. Months of coverage allowed viewers to form loyalties, suspicions, interpretations, and routines. Some watched as legal observers. Some watched as true crime followers. Some watched because Simpson had been a familiar face for decades. Some watched because the case seemed to expose larger truths about American justice, whether those truths concerned race, gender, policing, money, or fame. By the time the verdict came on, October 3rd, 1995, the country had not simply consumed a trial. It had lived with one. That is why the courtroom phase cannot be treated as a footnote after the chase. The Bronco made the case unforgettable in a single evening, but the trial made it unavoidable for months. And because the trial was televised, certain moments escaped the limits of the courtroom almost immediately. A phrase, a gesture, a demonstration, or a line of argument could be replayed and reduced into shorthand. The public did not remember every witness or every procedural ruling, but it remembered the moments that television could compress. Among them, one sentence from Johnny Cochran would become the most famous: "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." Before that phrase became cultural memory, it belonged to the courtroom. It came from a trial where evidence was not only presented, but performed before a national audience. The courtroom had taken over, and now the smallest object, the briefest line, and the most repeated image could carry the weight of the entire case. The previous chapter ended with a small object and a short sentence taking on a meaning far larger than their physical size. That was one of the defining features of the Simpson trial. Once the courtroom became daily television, evidence did not remain only in transcripts, exhibits, and legal argument. It became image, rhythm, repetition, and memory. The criminal trial had begun in Los Angeles County Superior Court on January 24th, 1995. It unfolded before Judge Lance Ito, with prosecutors Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden facing a defense team that included Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, Robert Shapiro, and Robert Kardashian. By the time the trial reached its final months, the country had already learned to watch the case not as an occasional legal update, but as an ongoing public drama. Guinness World Records lists the O.J. Simpson trial as the most viewed trial, with a daily average of 5.5 million Americans watching live coverage on 3 major cable networks between January 24th and October 3rd, 1995. That number matters because it helps explain why a single courtroom phrase could become a national possession. Millions were not merely reading about the trial afterward. They were seeing it, hearing it, and then seeing and hearing pieces of it, again through news programs, commentary, and replay. In an ordinary trial, a closing argument belongs first to the jury. It is directed toward the people who must decide the case under the law. But this was not an ordinary trial in its public life. The jury still held the formal power. The courtroom still had rules, objections, testimony, and evidence. Yet outside that room, the trial was also being interpreted by a vast audience that had no legal vote but enormous cultural attention. Johnny Cochran's phrase about the glove, remembered as, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," became the clearest example of that double life. Inside the legal setting, it functioned as argument. It connected a piece of evidence to the defense's demand for reasonable doubt. But outside the courtroom, it became something else, a line that could be repeated in a headline, quoted in conversation, played in a television segment, or recalled years later as shorthand for the whole proceeding. The force of the sentence came partly from its simplicity. It was short. It rhymed. It had a direct movement from condition to conclusion. If the glove did not fit, the jury had to acquit. The phrase did not require a viewer to understand every day of testimony or every procedural dispute. It compressed a long and complicated trial into a memorable formula. That compression is what television does especially well. The Simpson trial contained a huge amount of material. It included legal strategy, witness examination, argument over evidence, and the larger public context of race, policing, domestic violence, celebrity, and money. But television favors moments that can stand alone. A phrase becomes easier to carry than a record. A visual demonstration becomes easier to remember than days of testimony. A courtroom exchange becomes easier to replay than a legal filing. The glove phrase survived because it moved across all of those forms. It was verbal, but it evoked an image. It was legal, but it sounded like a slogan. It was part of a defense argument, but it quickly entered popular memory as a cultural catchphrase. The public could remember it even without remembering exactly where it appeared in the sequence of the trial. That is how courtroom language becomes media language. The Simpson case had already shown this pattern before the trial began. The white Ford Bronco had become a moving image that stood for the opening crisis, a famous man charged with murder, failing to surrender, followed by California Highway Patrol units across Southern California freeways while millions watched parading. The Bronco compressed fear, celebrity, law enforcement, and television into one object. Now the glove did something similar inside the courtroom. It became an object through which the broader struggle over evidence and trust could be seen. That struggle mattered because the trial was never received by the public as evidence alone. The case landed in Los Angeles after the March 1991 beating of Rodney King, a black motorist, and after the April 29, 1992 acquittals of 4 white law enforcement officers in connection with that beating, which triggered days of unrest in Los Angeles. That history shaped how many viewers understood the LAPD and the credibility of police evidence. It did not decide the trial by itself, but it formed part of the atmosphere in which the trial was watched. At the same time, Simpson's fame made every courtroom moment larger. He was not only a defendant. He had been a football hero, actor, broadcaster, and advertising figure. His public image had been built through television long before the chase and trial. The same medium that had helped make him familiar now made his criminal case unavoidable. When courtroom evidence appeared on screen, it arrived attached to a celebrity identity that millions of viewers had known for years. This is why the glove phrase became more than a line in a legal argument. It represented the meeting point of evidence, performance, and public interpretation. The evidence belonged to the case. The performance belonged to the courtroom. The interpretation belonged to the jury, but also to the millions of viewers who were forming opinions outside the courthouse. The word performance here does not mean that the trial was unreal. The charges were real. The deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman were real. The family's losses were real. The jury's decision would be real. But trials are also structured acts of persuasion. Lawyers choose language, sequence, emphasis, and tone. They present evidence not only for its existence, but for its meaning. In a televised trial, that work of persuasion becomes visible to people far beyond the jury box. Cochran's phrase showed how legal meaning could be sharpened into public memory. It did not carry the full complexity of the case. No catchphrase could. It could not contain every question about the murders at 875 South Bundy Drive, every argument made in Los Angeles County Superior Court, every dispute over police credibility, every conversation about domestic violence, or every response shaped by race and institutional trust. But it could stand in for the trial's most public lesson, that evidence in a courtroom is not only presented, it is interpreted. And because the trial was being watched daily, interpretation happened almost immediately. Viewers saw a moment, then heard commentators discuss it. They saw clips repeat. They talked about it at home, at work, in public spaces. The line moved from courtroom speech into national vocabulary. Its endurance came from that movement. It was not remembered only because it was said. It was remembered because television made it repeatable. This was one of the great transformations of the Simpson case. The courtroom did not replace the media spectacle that began with the Bronco. It extended it. The chase had shown a live event with no clear ending, a slow pursuit across freeways and city streets toward Rockingham Avenue. The trial created a slower form of suspense. Day after day, it asked viewers to absorb evidence, evaluate credibility, and wait for a decision. In that waiting, certain images and phrases became anchors. The glove became one of those anchors. It was small enough to be concrete, but large enough to carry symbolism. It allowed the public to talk about doubt, persuasion, and courtroom strategy through a single object. The phrase attached to it gave that object a rhythm. Together, they formed one of the most durable memories of the trial. But the danger of such memory is that it can make a complex legal proceeding seem simpler than it was. The trial ran from January 24, 1995, to the not guilty verdict on October 3, 1995. It involved many people, many arguments, and a national context that could not be reduced to one sentence. The phrase, "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit," became famous because it was powerful, but also because it was portable. It could travel farther than the record itself. By the end of the trial, that portability mattered. The country had not watched the same case in the same way. Some viewers focused on the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman and the demand for accountability. Some focused on the credibility of police evidence and the long history of conflict between law enforcement and black communities in Los Angeles. Some watched through the lens of celebrity and wealth. Others saw domestic violence, media excess, or legal theater. The glove phrase did not resolve those divisions. It sharpened them. To some, it represented effective advocacy and reasonable doubt. To others, it represented the power of performance in a trial already transformed by fame and television. Its meaning depended on what viewers believed they had been watching all along. That is why the phrase could outlive the verdict and still remain contested. It became cultural shorthand, but shorthand always leaves something out. It gave the public a way to remember the trial while also revealing how much of the trial's meaning was being fought over beyond the courtroom. As October 3rd, 1995 approached, the country was not simply waiting for a legal outcome. It was waiting to see which interpretation of the case would be given the force of a verdict. The evidence had been argued. The performances had been absorbed. The catchphrase had already entered national memory. What remained was the decision itself and the reaction that would show just how divided that memory had become. By the time the jury reached its decision, the Simpson trial had already become more than a courtroom proceeding. The evidence had been argued in Los Angeles County Superior Court. The lawyers had become public figures. The language of the trial had entered ordinary conversation. The glove, the phrase, and the daily coverage had given viewers symbols through which to understand the case, even when those symbols meant very different things to different people. On October 3rd, 1995, that long accumulation of argument and image reached its formal endpoint in the criminal case. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty of the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The words were brief. The consequences were not. A verdict is supposed to answer a legal question. In a criminal trial, the question is not whether the public feels satisfied or whether the case has resolved every moral uncertainty. The question is whether the prosecution has proved guilt under the rules and standards of criminal law. The jury's answer on October 3rd was not guilty. That answer ended the criminal trial against Simpson. It did not end the national argument about what the trial had meant. Part of the force of the moment came from the contrast between the smallness of the courtroom phrase and the size of the audience waiting outside it. For months, the trial had been watched, analyzed, and replayed across the country. Guinness World Records lists the O.J. Simpson trial as the most viewed trial, with a daily average of 5.5 million Americans watching live coverage on 3 major cable networks between January 24th and October 3rd, 1995. By the time the verdict came, the country had not simply heard about the case. It had lived with it as a repeated presence on television. That is why the acquittal became a national moment. It was not only because Simpson was famous, though fame mattered enormously. He had been a football star, an actor, a broadcaster, and an advertising figure before the killings at Bundy Drive and before the Bronco pursuit. His public image had been built partly through television, and then television became the medium through which that image was dismantled, defended, and reinterpreted. But celebrity alone does not explain the reaction to the verdict. The verdict became a dividing line because different audiences saw different trials. Some viewers saw a prosecution that had failed to meet its burden. Some saw a defense that had successfully challenged the reliability of police evidence and courtroom presentation. Some saw wealth and celebrity bending the legal system. Some saw long-standing mistrust of the Los Angeles Police Department brought into a courtroom and finally taken seriously. Some saw the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman being overshadowed by media spectacle. Others saw a criminal justice system whose authority could not be separated from race, policing, and power. These divisions were not only impressions, they were measured. ABC News polling archived by ICPSR asked respondents about the Simpson verdict, their perceptions of guilt or innocence, the possibility of police conspiracy, and whether the outcome would have differed if Simpson were white. The range of those questions matters. The polling did not treat the verdict as a narrow legal event only. It treated the verdict as a public test of belief, belief in the jury, belief in the police, belief in the evidence, belief in equal treatment, and belief in whether race had shaped the outcome or the interpretation of the outcome. That is one reason the Simpson case remained so difficult to summarize. A trial transcript can record testimony. A verdict form can record the decision. But neither can fully capture the larger question that many Americans were asking themselves. Do I trust the institutions that produce this result? The answer depended deeply on experience. A Gallup CNN and USA Today poll, summarized by UMKC's Famous Trials Project, found sharp racial differences after the verdict. 78% of black respondents called the verdict right. 42% of white respondents said the same. Those numbers have become part of the historical record of the case because they show the distance between public interpretations. The split was not a minor disagreement over legal detail. It revealed different relationships to police authority, courtroom credibility, and the meaning of reasonable doubt. The timing of the trial helps explain why that divide was so pronounced. The case unfolded in Los Angeles only a few years after the Rodney King beating and the unrest that followed the acquittal of 4 white law enforcement officers in connection with that videotaped beating. The beating occurred in March 1991. The acquittals on April 29, 1992, triggered days of unrest in Los Angeles. That context did not determine every reaction to the Simpson verdict, and it did not make all opinions uniform within any community. But it formed part of the public background against which police testimony and police credibility were judged and fed. For many Americans, the Simpson trial was not the first time they had seen Los Angeles law enforcement placed at the center of a national racial debate. The Rodney King video had already shown how a local police encounter could become a national image. The subsequent acquittals had already shown how a courtroom outcome could be experienced by many as an institutional failure. When the Simpson defense challenged the handling and credibility of evidence, those arguments landed in a country where trust in policing was already unevenly distributed. That did not mean every person who supported the verdict believed the same thing. It did not mean every person who rejected the verdict believed the same thing. But it does help explain why the reaction could not be reduced to a simple division between people who understood the evidence and people who did not. The trial became a place where legal judgment and historical memory collided. The ABC News polling questions about possible police conspiracy show how deeply that collision reached. To ask whether respondents believed there might have been a conspiracy was to recognize that the verdict had opened a wider debate over whether the official version of events could be trusted. To ask whether the result would have been different if Simpson were white was to place race directly inside the public interpretation of the legal outcome. These were not side issues that emerged later. They were part of how the verdict was immediately understood. The acquittal also exposed a tension between the legal meaning of not guilty and the public desire for a final answer. In criminal law, not guilty does not necessarily mean that every doubt has been resolved in favor of innocence as a matter of public belief. It means the jury did not find the prosecution's case sufficient for conviction under the criminal standard. But outside the courtroom, many viewers wanted the verdict to say more than that. They wanted it to declare truth. They wanted it to confirm what they already believed or force others to accept what they believed. Television intensified that expectation. The trial had been seen, not merely reported. Viewers had watched courtroom moments as though direct viewing could create certainty. But the same images did not produce the same conclusions. A repeated clip could reinforce confidence for one viewer and suspicion for another. A phrase could sound like clarity to one audience and performance to another. A witness, an exhibit, a procedural ruling, or a lawyer's argument could be absorbed through very different histories of trust. That is why the verdict felt to many like a national mirror. The country was not only reacting to Simpson, it was reacting to itself. For black respondents in the Gallup CNN and USA Today poll, summarized by UMKC, the high level of support for the verdict reflected, in part, the broader context of skepticism toward policing and criminal justice institutions. For white respondents, the lower level of agreement showed that many saw the acquittal as wrong, troubling, or disconnected from their interpretation of the evidence. The numbers do not explain every individual reaction, but they reveal the scale of the divide. 78% and 42% are not just statistics. They are evidence that the same verdict had entered two different public worlds. And still, at the center of it all were two deaths, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, killed outside Brown Simpson's home in Brentwood on June 12, 1994. The national argument over race, policing, celebrity, and legal trust did not erase that fact. It made the case larger, but it also risked pulling attention away from the victims and their families. The verdict resolved Simpson's criminal exposure in that courtroom, but it did not resolve the grief, the anger, or the competing claims about justice. The acquittal on October 3, 1995, therefore stands as both an ending and a beginning. It ended the criminal trial that had dominated American television. It began the long afterlife of the case as a reference point in debates over race, fame, domestic violence, policing, courtroom media, and public belief. The Bronco chase had shown how quickly a legal crisis could become a shared television ritual. The trial had shown how that ritual could stretch for months, turning procedure into daily drama. The verdict showed the limit of shared viewing. Millions could watch the same case unfold and still emerge with sharply different conclusions about what they had seen. After the words "not guilty," the courtroom chapter was closed, but the larger record was not. Another proceeding would follow, under a different legal standard, and the public archive of the case would continue to grow. The criminal verdict had settled one question in law. It had left the country arguing over many others. After the words "not guilty," the criminal case had reached its legal endpoint. But the Simpson story did not end there, because the verdict answered only the question placed before that jury, under that standard, in that courtroom. The public argument continued, and so did the legal record. A separate civil trial followed in 1997. In that proceeding, O.J. Simpson was found liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The civil jury ordered him to pay $33.5 million in damages to their families. That outcome matters because it has sometimes collapsed into the criminal verdict, as if the case produced only one legal answer. It did not. In criminal court, Simpson had been acquitted of murder on October 3, 1995. In civil court, under a different legal standard, he was held liable for the deaths. The distinction is not a technical footnote. It is part of the case's afterlife, and part of why the Simpson story remained unsettled in American memory. The same deaths led to different proceedings, different burdens of proof, and different legal results. For the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, the civil judgment was another public stage in a long and painful process. The case had begun with 2 killings outside Brown Simpson's Brentwood home on South Bundy Drive on June 12, 1994. Everything that followed, the chase, the cameras, the courtroom arguments, the polling, the catchphrases, the national division, rested on that fact. The civil trial returned attention to the people who had been killed and to the families who continued to seek accountability after the criminal acquittal. The judgment also reminds us that the phrase, "trial of the century," can distort scale. It can make one proceeding seem like the whole story. But the Simpson case was not only one trial. It was a sequence of events and records, a death investigation, an expected surrender that did not happen, a fugitive announcement, a slow freeway pursuit, an arrest at Rockingham Avenue, a criminal trial before Judge Lance Ito, a verdict that divided the country, a civil trial, and over time, a public archive. That archive continues in institutional form. The FBI vault hosts a multi-part public file under the name Orenthal James Simpson. Its presence there does not turn every released page into a final interpretation. It shows something more basic and more important for historical memory. Federal records connected to the case have been released through Freedom of Information Act processes, and the case remains part of the documentary record available to the public. In a story so shaped by television, that matters. The live broadcasts gave the country images, the Bronco moving slowly along Southern California freeways, the crowds on overpasses, the courtroom camera, the faces of lawyers, the stillness of people waiting for a verdict. But archives work differently from live television. They are slower. They do not arrive as spectacle. They collect, preserve, redact, release, and file. They remind us that public memory is made not only by what millions see at once, but by what institutions keep after the cameras turn away. Still, when the case is remembered, it often returns to the same image, a white Ford Bronco on the freeway. That vehicle became the opening object of the public drama. It was not the beginning of the case. The beginning was the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. But the Bronco was the moment when a murder investigation became a national live event. On June 17, 1994, Simpson had been expected to surrender. Instead, he was publicly described as a fugitive. His location was traced from a cellular phone call to the Santa Ana Freeway near Lake Forest in Orange County. The white Ford Bronco, driven by Al Cowlings, entered the frame, and with it came a new kind of shared viewing. The route itself became part of the memory. The Santa Ana Freeway, the Artesia Freeway, the San Diego Freeway, the long movement toward Brentwood. It was a police pursuit, but not in the familiar high-speed form. It was slow, tense, and unresolved. California Highway Patrol units followed Portman. Television helicopters watched from above. Viewers understood that something could go wrong at any moment, and that uncertainty held the audience in place. The Bronco compressed the themes that would define the entire case. Celebrity was there because Simpson was already known as a football star, actor, broadcaster, and advertising figure. Policing was there because he was a murder suspect being followed by law enforcement through Los Angeles freeway space. Race was there, not as a simple label attached afterward, but as part of the wider setting of Los Angeles only 2 years after the Rodney King unrest. Domestic violence was there because Nicole Brown Simpson's death helped intensify public attention to abuse, victim services, shelters, and the protections associated with the Violence Against Women Act. Television was there, not merely as witness, but as the mechanism that made the pursuit a shared national experience. And courtroom performance was waiting just ahead, because the chase delivered Simpson not only into custody, but into a legal drama that would become daily programming. That is why the Bronco still matters. It was a vehicle, but it also became a moving screen. It carried the case from police procedure into mass spectatorship. It showed how quickly modern public judgment can begin forming before a trial starts, before evidence is tested in court, before witnesses testify, before instructions are read to a jury. Millions watched a man not yet tried, already famous, already accused, already surrounded by narrative. The country was not only receiving information, it was beginning to sort itself into interpretations. By the time the criminal trial opened in January 1995, many viewers had already lived through the chase as a collective event. They had seen the freeways. They had heard the reports. They had watched the slow progress toward Rockingham Avenue. The trial then extended that experience, turning testimony and argument into daily television. The verdict revealed how differently the same public event could be understood. The civil judgment added another legal conclusion. The FBI vault file became one part of the continuing public record. The Simpson case endures because it sits at a crossroads that has only become more familiar. It shows a society watching law in real time, treating procedure as drama, and bringing older conflicts into new media forms. It shows how fame can amplify suspicion and sympathy at the same time. It shows how race and policing can shape the reception of evidence. It shows how domestic violence can be overshadowed by spectacle, even when it is central to the human tragedy. It shows how a courtroom can become a stage without ceasing to be a court. And it shows the power and danger of the first image. A slow-moving white Bronco did not decide the case. It did not prove guilt or innocence. It did not replace the legal standards of either the criminal trial or the civil trial. But it opened the public drama through which so many people first entered the story. It made the case visible before it was fully knowable. It turned a Los Angeles pursuit into a national ritual of watching. That is the afterlife of the chase. Not only the memory of a freeway or a famous passenger or a line of police vehicles behind him. The deeper legacy is the recognition that modern judgment often begins on screen. Before the trial, before the verdict, before the archive, there was an image moving slowly through the evening, asking the country to watch, and showing how much the country would bring to what it saw.